They thought your silence meant you were finished, that you had finally given up, that they had broken you for good. But silence isn't surrender. Silence is power. It's patience. It's the moment between the strike and the roar. And while they celebrated your so-called downfall, you were simply collecting yourself, piece by piece, thought by thought, emotion by emotion. You weren't gone. You were becoming something they didn't see coming. They didn't understand that real strength doesn't always scream. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it sits still, waiting. And in those moments when you were alone, when no one saw the tears, the doubts, or the weight you carried, you were growing. They called your silence weakness, but it was the fire being refueled. It was the storm pulling back just before the thunder. People will try to break you because they're afraid of your voice. They fear the power in your truth. They fear the moment you realize that your voice isn't just sound, it's purpose. They fear what happens when you stop explaining yourself and start owning your presence. And so they pushed, they mocked, they betrayed. They tried to bury you under shame, guilt, and judgment. But what they didn't know was that the more pressure they applied, the more strength you were building under it. There's something unshakable about a person who's walked through the fire and still stands tall. They thought you were done because you weren't reacting. But you weren't made to react. You were made to rise. You were studying every attack, learning every lesson, transforming every scar into armor. They didn't break you. They built the reason you would no longer stay quiet. You found out who you really are, not in the applause, but in the silence. In the rejection, in the heartbreak. That's where your voice was shaped. That's where your courage was formed. Not when people praised you, but when they ignored you. Not when you were surrounded by love, but when you stood in the cold alone and decided that your story wasn't over. And then something changed. Slowly, your silence began to shift, not into noise, but into something louder than any scream. It became truth. You started speaking not to please, not to fit in, but to express what needed to be said. You weren't interested in comfort anymore. You weren't seeking approval. You had outgrown the need to be liked by those who only wanted to control you. Your voice, once suppressed, became a weapon, not to harm, but to protect what matters, to defend your worth. To draw a line that says, "This is who I am, I will not shrink anymore." When people try to break you, they hope you'll stay small. But the irony is, they become the reason you finally grow into the version of yourself you were always meant to be. Their doubts gave you direction. Their silence taught you self-worth. Their attacks reminded you of your own resilience. And when you finally opened your mouth again, it wasn't to explain. It was to declare, to take up space, to speak with a power born not from ego, but from experience. The world isn't changed by people who stay silent just to keep the peace. It's changed by people who know when to speak and what to say, and who are no longer afraid of being heard. You became louder because your silence had done its job. It had prepared you, centered you. It had helped you remember who you are. And now every word you speak carries weight, because it's not just noise. It's survival, it's purpose. It's strength learned the hard way. They thought they ended your story, but they only ended the version of you that stayed quiet to be accepted. What rose in its place was someone who understands. Being broken isn't the end. It's the beginning of something louder, something greater, something unstoppable. And now you speak, not just for yourself, but for those who are still finding the courage. Pain has a way of showing up uninvited. It comes when you least expect it, hits where you're most vulnerable, and tests what you thought you knew about yourself. And when it came for you, it didn't knock. It shattered. It tore through you with disappointment, betrayal, heartbreak, rejection. It didn't whisper, it screamed, and for a moment you thought maybe this is where you'd finally break. Maybe this would be the thing that crushes you completely, but it didn't, because what pain tried to destroy, it ended up shaping. You see, there's a version of you that existed before the pain, a softer, maybe more trusting version. And there's nothing wrong with that. But pain introduced you to a deeper truth. It forced you to look at yourself in the rawest form. No masks, no illusions, just you and the struggle, and it was there, in the darkness, that you started to change. Not because you wanted to, but because you had no other choice. The world told you pain was something to escape, to run from, to numb, but you didn't. You sat in it. You let it do its work. You let it cut, carve, and expose every hidden wound, every buried fear. And in doing so, you discovered something powerful. Pain doesn't just hurt. It reveals, it shows you what still needs healing. It shows you where your strength is buried. And most of all, it shows you that you are capable of surviving far more than you ever thought possible. They thought the pain would silence you, that it would weaken you, but it didn't. It made your voice steadier, clearer, more certain, because pain stripped away everything fake. It stripped away the parts of you that lived for approval, that feared rejection, that stayed quiet to avoid conflict. What was left wasn't fragile, it was fire. You didn't just heal, you evolved. You didn't just recover, you transformed. Every scar tells a story, not of defeat, but of survival. And now when you speak, it's not just emotion, it's earned wisdom. You don't talk from theory, you talk from experience, from wounds that turned into strength, from days when you could barely breathe yet still chose to show up. You don't need to shout to be heard anymore. Your presence alone speaks volumes. Pain didn't crush you. It crafted you. It gave you the gift of clarity. You started to see who was for you and who only stood beside you when things were easy. You saw the difference between comfort and growth, between loyalty and convenience, and with that clarity, you began to walk differently. Speak differently, choose differently. The same people who caused your pain expected you to fall apart. They thought they were writing the end of your story, but they didn't realize they were fueling the beginning of your next chapter. They didn't realize that when you hit rock bottom, you weren't breaking. You were building, brick by brick. Stronger, smarter, wiser, you began to stand in a way that couldn't be shaken anymore, because your strength wasn't theoretical. It was tested, proven. You started to realize that your pain had purpose, not in the sense that it was fair or deserved, but in the sense that it awakened something in you that comfort never could. It taught you how to speak even when your voice trembled. It taught you how to be alone without being lost. It taught you how to be resilient without becoming bitter. And now, your loudness isn't just about making noise. It's about speaking from a place of truth. You got louder because pain gave you something real to say. You became someone who doesn't just survive the fire, but carries the torch for others still walking through it. What tried to crush you became the reason you rise with more purpose, more focus, and more clarity than ever before. You're not the same, and that's the point. You grew through the very thing meant to break you, and now nothing can silence a voice like yours. Rejection hurts in ways people rarely talk about. It doesn't just bruise your pride, it cuts deep into your sense of worth. Whether it came from someone you trusted, a door you hoped would open, or a world that didn't see your value, it stings. And at first, you wondered if maybe they were right. Maybe you weren't enough. Maybe you were asking for too much. Maybe you were too loud, too different, too much of everything they didn't want. But in the silence that followed, something unexpected began to rise, clarity. The people who rejected you weren't showing you your limits, they were revealing theirs. They weren't defining your value, they were exposing their inability to see it. Rejection didn't mean you weren't worthy. It meant the space you were trying to fit in was too small for what you're becoming. It meant life was rerouting you, not punishing you. And the more you sat with that truth, the more power you began to reclaim. You stopped begging to be chosen. You stopped bending yourself in half to fit their version of acceptable. You stopped handing over your voice just to stay in rooms that made you question your own light. And in that process, you found something rejection could never take: self-respect. That's where your fire started, not in acceptance but in refusal, not when you were welcomed but when you were shut out. They thought pushing you away would break you, but what they didn't see is that rejection became the very force that reconnected you with yourself. You stopped chasing approval and started walking in alignment. You started asking better questions. Do I even want to be where I wasn't welcomed? Why am I trying to prove myself to people who never tried to understand me? The more you questioned, the clearer your direction became. You realized you don't need validation to be valuable. You don't need permission to take up space. And you certainly don't need to stay quiet just because others are uncomfortable with your truth. Rejection showed you the places where you were never meant to stay. It pushed you out of circles that were draining your soul. It closed doors that were never going to lead to your purpose, and that's when the shift happened. You stopped trying to be accepted and started accepting yourself. Fully, loudly, unapologetically. You began to stand taller, speak clearer, and live bolder. Not out of arrogance, but out of awareness. You had finally understood your worth isn't up for debate. It doesn't rise or fall based on who decides to stay or walk away. It is constant. It is earned through your resilience, your heart, your truth. You got louder, not to be heard by them, but to finally hear yourself. To remind yourself of everything you bring to the table. You stopped whispering your dreams, your needs, your boundaries. You spoke them clearly because rejection no longer scared you. You had already lived through the worst of it. And instead of weakening you, it made you bulletproof. Now, when people doubt you, it doesn't shake you. Because you know who you are. You've already survived not being chosen. You've already walked through the fire of being overlooked, dismissed, misunderstood. And you didn't crumble, you recalibrated, you didn't shrink, you expanded. Your voice, once hesitant, is now rooted in conviction. You speak not just with words, but with presence, with the confidence of someone who's been broken, rejected, but never defeated. You carry the energy of someone who turned no into redirection, and redirection into reinvention. They thought they ended something when they rejected you, but they started something instead. They triggered your awakening. They forced you to look inward and find a voice that wasn't built to beg. It was built to lead. And now you walk with that voice. You speak with that voice. You live with that voice, because you don't need to be chosen by others when you've already chosen yourself. There comes a moment when you stop negotiating with yourself over your worth. A moment when you realize that shrinking to fit into someone else's comfort zone only leaves you feeling small. You spent so much time wondering if you were too much, too bold, too honest, too intense, and for a while you tried to tone it down. You tried to be more agreeable, more palatable, more acceptable. But no matter how much you softened yourself to be liked, it was never enough for the people who were committed to misunderstanding you. And that's when something inside you began to shift, quiet at first, like a whisper. You're not here to be tolerated. You're here to be respected, because the truth is, your worth isn't a mirror. It's not something that changes based on who's standing in front of you. It's not a reflection of someone's mood, approval, or opinion. It's yours, and it's not up for debate. They tried to question it, tried to push you into doubt. Some did it openly, criticizing you, labeling you. Others did it subtly, through silence, through dismissive words, through withholding what you deserved. But you started to see it for what it was: projection, insecurity dressed up as authority, people who couldn't face their own inadequacies trying to control yours. And the moment you saw that clearly, you stopped letting their opinion define your reality. You stopped explaining yourself to people who had no intention of understanding you. You stopped proving yourself to people who were determined to forget everything you've overcome. You stopped giving access to people who treated your energy like it was disposable. Because your worth is not a discount item. It's not something to be bartered or begged for. You started setting boundaries not as a punishment to others, but as a protection for yourself. You started choosing peace over people, pleasing. You began to show up fully as yourself, even if it made others uncomfortable, because you realized that shrinking may keep the peace around you, but it shatters the peace within you. And once you tasted what it felt like to live in alignment with your truth, you couldn't go back. You couldn't fake smiles just to avoid conflict. You couldn't keep making yourself small in rooms where your presence was needed. You couldn't tolerate being half seen, half heard, half respected. Because when you know your worth, you stop settling for pieces of love, pieces of loyalty, pieces of attention. You want wholeness or nothing at all. People may call it arrogance, may say you've changed, but that's because they benefited from the version of you that didn't know better. The version that overgave, that over-explained, that overcommitted to people who couldn't even meet you halfway. That version of you no longer exists, not out of bitterness, but out of growth. You speak with more clarity now. You walk with more certainty. You've reclaimed the time, energy, and love you used to pour into the wrong places. And you've redirected it into yourself, into becoming who you were always meant to be, before the world tried to convince you otherwise. They don't get to decide if you matter. That decision was made the moment you started rising despite everything that was meant to keep you small. And now you show up not to be accepted, but to be authentic, not to fit in, but to stand tall. You're not loud because you want attention. You're loud because you finally stopped hiding. You finally stopped apologizing for being exactly who you are. You're not interested in being liked by everyone. You're interested in being real, and that realness is your power. It's your freedom, and it's your reminder that anyone who makes you question your worth doesn't deserve a seat at your table. You no longer chase approval, you stand in truth, and from that place you rise. Every time they doubted you, every time they counted you out, they thought they were closing the chapter on your story. But what they didn't realize is that every dismissal, every insult, every attempt to silence you was fuel. It was pressure on the spring that would eventually launch you further than they ever imagined. You didn't respond with anger. You didn't fight back with bitterness. You didn't waste time explaining yourself. You just worked quietly, relentlessly, and when you came back, you didn't come back to prove them wrong. You came back to prove to yourself that you were never the weak one. People love a quiet failure. It makes them feel more secure in their own comfort. But when someone refuses to stay down, when someone rises again and again, louder, stronger, more focused, they don't know what to do with that. You became the reminder that pain doesn't always destroy. It transforms. That setbacks don't always end things. Sometimes they start the most powerful chapters. And you've had your share of setbacks. You've heard the whispers. They'll never make it. They peaked. They don't have it in them. You felt the coldness of being overlooked. You tasted the sting of being ignored while less deserving voices were elevated. And in those moments, you could have let the bitterness in. You could have stopped trying. You could have made yourself smaller so the noise would stop. But instead, you made a different choice. You chose to keep going, not loudly at first, just with consistency, just with grit. You started building something that didn't rely on outside applause. Something grounded, something real. Your progress wasn't about spotlight. It was about substance, about making sure that when you returned, you wouldn't just make a sound, you'd make an impact. That's the power of not needing validation. That's the strength in learning to clap for yourself when no one else does. When you're no longer looking over your shoulder, when you're no longer seeking someone else's approval, your energy changes. You stop chasing and start creating. You stop explaining and start embodying. So when you got louder, it wasn't out of ego. It was out of evolution. It was because your silence had run its course. You had learned, healed, rebuilt, and now it was time to speak, to show, to be everything you'd quietly been becoming. Your return wasn't a performance. It was the natural result of your growth. And those same people who once ignored you, now they're paying attention, but you've changed. You're no longer here to be seen. You're here to shine with or without the spotlight. You don't speak to impress anymore, you speak to impact. Your voice has weight now, not because it's louder, but because it comes from a place of truth. You've earned that voice. You've fought for it. You've rebuilt it from the ground up. That's what they didn't understand. This version of you wasn't born from praise. It was born from pressure, from pain, from being left out and counted out, and still choosing to rise. Now, when people hear you speak, they feel it, not just in their ears, but in their chest, because it's real. Because it's lived, because it's not about showing off, it's about showing up. You got louder because your silence was never meant to be permanent. It was preparation, and here you are, not to compete, not to convince, but to stand in the fullness of who you are. Not just louder in voice, but louder in purpose, in presence, in power, and nothing speaks louder than a soul that refused to stay small. They thought they ended your story, but you turned every no into momentum. You came back not because of them, but because you never stopped believing in you. When you found your voice again, it wasn't just about reclaiming your power. It was about becoming the voice for someone else still sitting in silence. You didn't just survive the storm for your own healing. You survived so you could speak into the lives of those still trapped in the pain you once knew so well. That's the beauty of growth. It doesn't end with you. It becomes a light for someone who hasn't yet found the switch inside themselves. Because the truth is, someone is always watching, not in judgment but in quiet hope, hoping they can be as strong as you, hoping they'll find their way out, hoping that if someone like you could walk through betrayal, rejection, pain, and still rise, then maybe they can too. And when you began to speak, really speak, your words became more than sound. They became survival for someone else. For someone who didn't think they mattered. For someone who thought being broken was the end of their story. They tried to break you, and yes, for a while it worked. You were quiet. You were uncertain. You were hurting. But you didn't stay there. You listened to the silence inside you until you heard something deeper: resilience. Purpose, a calling to rise, not just for yourself, but for everyone who's ever been made to feel like their voice didn't matter. That's when you became louder, not just in volume, but in meaning. Every word had weight because every word came from lived experience, from pain that was processed, not avoided, from lessons that were earned, not just learned. You weren't speaking from a place of bitterness. You were speaking from a place of becoming. And people felt that. They saw that you didn't have to scream to be powerful. You didn't need to be aggressive to be respected. You were grounded, clear, and unshakable because your voice was no longer just a reaction. It was a decision. You chose to speak up, to stand up, to show up, so others could believe they had permission to do the same. This isn't about being loud for the sake of noise. It's about truth. It's about waking people up. It's about reminding those who have been conditioned to stay quiet that they're allowed to take up space, that they're allowed to feel deeply, to speak boldly, to live fully. And if your journey gives even one person the courage to stop apologizing for who they are, then every tear you cried, every setback you faced, it all meant something. You didn't go through what you went through just to go back to hiding. You went through it to rise, to become, and now every step you take forward is a silent message to those watching. You can too. You've become an example, not because you're perfect, but because you're real, because you're proof that you can be broken and still be worthy, still be valuable, still be powerful. They tried to silence you because they knew your voice held power. They were afraid of what would happen when you finally remembered who you were, when you stopped needing their approval, when you stopped editing yourself to fit in. But what they feared the most is what makes you unstoppable now. You became the voice others needed, not because you planned it, but because you earned it through the hard nights, through the empty rooms, through the doubts and the loneliness. And when you finally rose, you rose for more than yourself. You became a mirror, a reminder, a spark. You got louder because staying quiet meant staying invisible. And you were never born to disappear. You were born to lead, to live, to be fully heard.